there probably are lots of these experiences that we could have that we're not having. And so we end up learning it from a book, or we end up learning it from a YouTube video. And that's something AI can't deliver, right? Like that, I'm in that space. I'm looking up the stars in the Science Museum, or I'm picking up a cannonball from a battlefield from the Civil War. And those types of experiences, interacting with those types of objects, bring learning to life. It's about making learning more physical, more real, particularly in an age where we're surrounded and immersed in digital technology. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Matthew Worwood.
And my name is Dr. Cyndi Burnett.
This is the Fueling Creativity in Education podcast.
On this podcast, we'll be talking about various creativity topics and how they relate to the field of education.
We'll be talking with scholars, educators, and resident experts about their work, challenges they face, and exploring new perspectives of creativity.
All with the goal to help fuel a more rich and informed discussion that provides teachers, administrators, and emerging scholars with the information they need to infuse creativity into teaching and learning.
So let's begin. Cue celebration music.
That's a lot.
It was a lot. We're celebrating it. You listen. Number one, you told me to have fun, and number two, you said open it up and say we're celebrating. So we're not cutting this. We're going to continue to celebrate it.
We are celebrating. It's the end of the year. We have made it to June of 2025.
We have. And listen, we're thinking of everyone. Some of you, we're well aware, might have another week when this episode's coming out. Some of you might be fortunate in that you're already chilling and could be even at the beach, though you might not be listening to the podcast. We won't take offense if you're not listening to the podcast while you're at the beach. We've been doing the podcast for 4 years. Cyndi corrected me earlier when I was saying 3 to 4 years. 4 years of the podcast, and we've kind of fallen in this habit of doing the kind of final episode of the academic year, somewhat reflective, not so much of a debrief, because there's been a lot of debriefs over the last few weeks, but this is about kind of looking back, right, Cyndi, over the academic year and what we've kind of learned and where we think we are in terms of education at the moment. Because there's a lot. We had the pandemic, but now there's even, you could argue, there's even more disruption happening at the moment in terms of public schooling, or rather just formal learning in general. And Cyndi, you already reached out. You said, let's have a conversation about this topic. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what we'll be talking about?
So recently, Matt and I we have a lot of offline conversations on an app called Marco Polo. And we were talking about what's happening right now in education. And there are so many conversations going on in the field right now, not only in the creativity field, but also in education with regard to artificial intelligence, which is a part of this. But really, what are we trying to teach our students? What are the skills and abilities that we want them to walk away with in education? And this is something that Matt and I have been going back and forth with. And I said to him, we should bring this into the podcast, and we should do this as part of our final episode. Because as Matt mentioned, we have been doing the podcast for the last 4 years. So Matt and I have seen this conversation around educational change, evolve over the last 4 years. And now it was started out as this quiet murmur of what do our students need? And I think we need change. And, if you've been listening to the podcast since we started, we've had a lot of conversations around, do we need a revolution or an evolution of education? And my stance was always evolution. Let's make small changes. Small changes make a big impact, which is a great phrase to say. But now with the onset of AI, and now that, in the last 2 years, AI has sort of infiltrated a lot of education. I shouldn't say all of it, but a lot of education and the work that we're doing and how we're seeing jobs shift and what's happening politically and all of these changes, I would say, in the last 6 months and coming off of the pandemic on top of all of that is so what are we doing with our students? And what should a typical day for a 10-year-old look like? What should a typical day for a 15-year-old look like? Do they still need to be learning content? And this was a conversation Matt and I had the other day around doors opening. And Matt talked a little bit about how we want to give them enough information to keep the doors open if they want to go into a particular area. So Matt, I don't know if you remember, we interviewed Dr. Colleen Kelly, who was absolutely brilliant, talking about chemistry. And if chemistry wasn't taught at an early age and developed as a child got older, then it made it increasingly more challenging as they went into college to do well in chemistry and then to become a doctor. So we might be losing doctors because they can't gain that access to knowledge in chemistry at an older age. On the flip side of that, if we look at a student, all right, I'll give my daughter as an example, who, as Matt knows, is very much a dancer. She's an artistic person. She's expressive. She loves musical theater. She's taking physics this year. She doesn't enjoy science. Does she need to know physics going forward? Now, I have always been under the stance that students should have at least what I would call a minimum viable knowledge base around all subjects. But recently, with the onset of AI and having access to so many domains, what do they actually need to know? Do they need to have a foundation in math that goes into algebra and geometry and statistics? Do they need to know that? Do they need to know chemistry if they know that there's no chance they're going to go on to become a doctor? So what are those things that we need to know and what we need to be teaching our students at this point to help them thrive in the future? So I think that is the starting point for our discussion today. So, Matt, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about these skills that we need to be teaching our students?
Well, you know what? I think I mean, it's going to look different through the grades, number one. Two, I liked the question you were posing earlier on when you said, what does a day in the life of a student look like when they're 10 years old versus what they're 15 years old? And, you know, it's interesting because it centers around content. And my 10-year-old, you know, we went on a field trip yesterday, and it's where you've got this kind of, 19th century village. 1830 is where it's set, and you've got actors playing the characters of that period, and you've got the mills and the working mills, so you actually can go into the mills and you can see. We went into, for example, the sawmill, and we saw the saw cutting the log and the timber, and we was able to have conversations with the kids around, you know, why they might need timber and things like that. And I kind of found myself reflecting, probably because of the conversation that we had about why do we always cram these incredible field trips at the end of the academic year? You know, it's like, if you've got time for it, let's do it.
Right.
And then I think about the fact when I was teaching, if I'm honest with you, like I think we had to make a commitment of 1 or 2 school trips a year. I can't remember. But I remember, like, if I'm brutally honest, I was so tired. It was very difficult for me to think more creative. I just went on the default school trip that the school always goes on and everyone's familiar with. And it was a good school trip, and the kids enjoyed it. But it's not as if I really, you know, had identified a purpose for that field trip. You know, what was the experience I was giving those 6 or 7-year-olds at the time that they were getting that they couldn't get in the classroom? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, we spend all this time talking about student engagement, and we spend all this time talking about students being able to get curious and explore their interests. And there I was on this field trip, and you could see it, like the kids were completely immersed in learning about the sawmill and the wood, and thinking about the food that they would be eating during this time. They were really understanding that they wouldn't have electronics, they wouldn't have electricity. They were looking at the games that the kids at the time would be playing with. They were thinking, they were having conversations about the horse. And, you know, one of the characters said that, I've never seen the ocean before. And, you know, the kids were reflecting on, why can't you see the ocean? They were saying, because it's a long way from here. I can't walk there. So I need a horse. And not many people have horses in this village. And the discussions that we were having were the type of conversations that we have been talking about on this show for the last few years, that we want to cultivate and facilitate in our teaching and learning environments. And I sat down, I'm like, I'm sure we could do it in the classroom, but I believe we definitely can do it when we go and have these types of extracurricular activities, these types of field trips, the museums, etc. So, and I know there are logistical reasons, and I know that there are budgetary reasons why they're not having a lot of them. But when you were asking me that question about a 10-year-old, I'm like, content, yes, but what if you're learning content building up to a field trip? And then the field trip then facilitates the next 4 or 5 weeks of content. And then you go on another field trip and it facilitates the next 4 or 5 weeks of content. And then we're sprinkling in more of these kind of like these field trips, whether they're museums or other cultural institutions, going to the state capitals, going to libraries, just having conversations about an old library and kids going in. And there's probably lots of different things that we can do within our community that are field trips that could facilitate great learning. We spoke about nature reserves in our final debrief. Like, go on nature reserves, all those different things. I could be wrong. I just don't see that happening. I mean, I just feel like everything's squeezed at the end and it doesn't have the same purpose anymore. So that's what I see as a 10-year-old experience.
I think the key point there, Matt, is purpose and intent. Because I think you can go on these great field trips and see these wonderful things. But I think one of the important things about field trips is purpose. So, for example, my daughter recently went to a big art gallery in town, and she came back after with a group of her friends, and they were talking about it. I said, well, how was the art gallery? And they said, it was bad. And I said, what do you mean it was bad? And they said, well, we just went and we were just in this room with all this art. We had a tour guide, but the tour guide didn't explain anything. And then we went to the next room and it was like this person was just moving us around, but we didn't really do anything. We didn't learn anything. And I think when you go into an experience like that, you have to have some sort of setup. What is it that you want students to gain from attending whatever this place is? And how can you get them there? And one of the ways we can do this is through heightening anticipation, which is, as you know, Matt, I'm a big Torrance incubation model person, written a book about it, and really getting students excited about going to this place. So what I would recommend, let's just take this art gallery and then I'll shoot it back to you around this wonderful space that you went to yesterday. But if you know you're going to an exhibit, to show students maybe a short video and say, okay, I want you to see what you can identify when you go into the art gallery of this artist's work. And what does this artist's work mean? And then really to extend that learning to say, how has this artist's work influenced your life? So if you were going back to that, what is the name of the place that you went to yesterday?
Sturbridge Village.
Sturbridge Village. What could you do with those students to really heighten their anticipation before they even go? What would you say?
Well, and to your point, I think the teacher who is a brilliant teacher I'm having to bring on the show, this particular trip, they've been studying that period of time. And so I suppose it comes down to the focus to which you as the teacher wanted to explore. For me, I probably would be interested in the sciences and probably power and energy. And that might make the meals fascinating, maybe posing the question, how do they get energy? What's their main source of energy? But I think probably playing games, getting them to make connections about, imagine if you didn't have an iPad or any electronics, would you get to play games? And what about if there was no lights? Go home tonight, turn all the lights off and see if you can navigate your way to your bedroom. How would you do that? And I think that might be a nice build up to kind of like set them up for something like that. And I think what you're highlighting there is how you're integrating that experience outside the classroom into the curriculum. And I think that kind of like brings me back to that point is there probably are lots of these experiences that we could have that we're not having. And so we end up, learning it from a book or we end up learning it from a YouTube video. And that's something AI can't deliver, right? Like that, I'm in that space, I'm looking up the stars in the Science Museum, or I'm picking up a cannonball from a battlefield from the Civil War. And like those types of experiences, interacting with those types of objects, bring learning to life. I think Jonathan Nalder spoke a lot about objects and how I think he brought, I want to say, did he bring a space rock or a meteorite into class and had everyone hold it? But it's about making learning more physical, more real. And that for me, when going back to your initial question, what should a school experience or a learning experience, formal learning experience look like for a 10-year-old? I say more field trips. Like that's my response to that question. More field trips, particularly in an age where we're surrounded and immersed in digital technology.
Love it. And I think to flip that around just for a moment, we can also think about what Billy Allman told us, which is if you can't go on field trips because of budgets, how do you bring field trips into the classroom? So if you haven't listened to that episode, make sure you do, because that's a really fun one.
Do you want to bring more creative and critical thinking into your school? Look no further than our podcast sponsor, Curiosity to Create.
Curiosity to Create is a nonprofit organization dedicated to engaging professional development for school districts and empowering educators through online courses and personal coaching.
And if you're craving a community of creative educators who love new ideas, don't miss out on their Creative Thinking Network. Get access to monthly webinars, creative lesson plans, and a supportive community, all focused on fostering creativity in the classroom.
To learn more, check out curiositytocreate.org or check out the links in the show notes for this episode.
So, Matt, we've looked at the younger ages, maybe 10 in elementary school. Let's get a little bit older, but let's not go to high school just yet. Let's think about that sweet spot of like 8th to 9th grade, which I know you have a son who is going to be going into 9th grade in the fall. What are the things they should be learning now? Do they need to still have all of that content like earth science and poetry? Do they need to be learning all of these things in 8th and 9th grade? Or should there be a different focus? What do you think?
Well, it's a tough one because you spoke earlier on about the idea of having doors open. And, you know, as a college professor and also obviously I advise undergraduate students, one of the things that I'm always telling parents and undergraduate students is that it's really tough for you to come in and say, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. You know, I don't want to talk about the world changing and we don't know what the future jobs will look like. Just to interact with an 18-year-old, let alone a 14-year-old, and have them think that they know what they want to do when they don't know half of the things that they could do.
Right.
Right. It's too tough. So I think trying to find ways to expose them to the world, to life, is one of the things that I think is important, so they can continue to expand that. But what it does mean, and this is where I recognize there's the challenge, it means that you do kind of need to be in a scenario where that includes exposing them to the content, to the disciplines, to the subjects, so they can develop that foundational knowledge in all of these different areas. Now, I think it's a completely different discussion when you're talking about the method of instruction. You could potentially argue, I would argue the field trip piece that I just spoke about, yes, it does fit under the category of method of instruction, but I would also say that the experience itself is something that expands learning far beyond the classroom environment. And I say it adds more value than just learning content. So I think that I have to say yes to continuing to learn about the earth sciences because you don't know. You don't want to close that door. It might not be the earth science they fall in love with, but it might be that the knowledge they acquire from earth sciences allows them to unlock an understanding for something else that then leads to that passion that then goes on to pursue a career. Had they not had that foundational knowledge in earth science, they may not have been able to have unlocked that understanding that then ignited the passion. So it really is a conundrum, and it's super duper hard to answer that. I haven't been able to answer it. But what I would say is, and this is the thing where I have conversations with educators and they say, but we're cramming so much stuff in. We may have to kind of like accept that we can't teach everything. Yeah. You know, and that's where maybe we go back to people like Todd Lubart, and maybe there's opportunities for us to find ways of measuring the creative potential in different domains. And we come up with better strategies of helping students select, I don't want to use the word tracks, but learning experiences that support where they've been identified as having creative potential, but also some type of curiosity. I don't want to use the word interest because there's still interests that they may discover, but some level of curiosity. And perhaps what it is, Cyndi, is we simply say it could be one of those scenarios where we say, look, how about we do 4 or 5 things really well and accept that that's better than doing 15 things not very well. And so if we're fortunate, we get some of those kids that really get to take a deep dive into something that they're really passionate about and they have a lot of creative potential in. And there is that risk that some students won't ever get to find that creative potential because they don't get to explore the things that maybe they were destined to do great in. But I would argue at this current time, it's not as if we're satisfying that anyway for some of those students.
Right.
So I think that's, I mean, I've got some other follow-ups, the idea of learning to cook and things like that and bringing back home economics. But I think I'll stop there. For me as a 13-year-old, it is a case of, yes, we do need to cover content, but maybe it's a case of giving up and saying we can't cover everything. So let's choose and do things really, really well. And maybe the conversation is, how do we choose?
So there's a lot of things I liked about what you said. I like the fact, and I know you didn't use tracks, but I do sort of like tracks a little bit because it gives you this opportunity to say, I'd like to go play around in this area, whether it be engineering or writing or performing arts, right? So you have sort of this track that you could spend more of your time, not all of your time, but more of your time each day working on that track as you start to head into high school and start to close a few doors, not close all the doors. So I really like this door metaphor because I like this idea of being in, you sort of start life and all these doors are open and then they just start shutting as you get older and you start to narrow down what you want to do and knowing that you might go through a door and then realize, as we both did. I mean, we both had careers in acting and then we got out of that door. We had careers in education and then we got out of that, and it's like you sort of go through, it's like a journey instead of just shutting all the doors and you're locked in a room. You're never really locked in a room. There's always more doors you could open or find, but sometimes it takes time to discover those doors. But I think that having more experiences for students to take dives into the things that they're interested in and to eliminate some of the content and knowledge that we're expecting of students. And I want to go to that point about sort of life skills, because I think this, as I see this generation and Gen Z, emerging into the workforce, you're seeing students who really don't know how to communicate with each other. And I've had a lot of conversations with high school parents and teachers who are just saying, the students, they don't know how to communicate together. They don't know how to collaborate together. They don't know how to work together. And even just on their devices all the time. So they don't really know how to sit and have a conversation in real life with each other. And I think we need to bring some of that back. And I think especially with the onset of AI, we're going to need those relationships as we continue to head into the future. I mean, if we look at relationships, are so much of a base of what makes us happy in life. So I think going beyond like making money and having a good career, it's like, what kind of life do you want to live? And I think I want to live a life and I want my children to have a life where they're able to connect with other human beings. And I feel like there is, in my opinion, and I'm curious what you think, and I'm really curious what our listeners think as well. Do you think this new generation, this Gen Z and the generation after, which is Gen A?
I do not know, and I'm not going to try and guess.
Okay. Where this new generation is emerging, and are they lacking this ability to really communicate and work with others and play with others and think with others and enjoy life with other people? Or is there this disconnect? What do you think?
So, Cyndi, I actually just realized I think it's actually called Gen Alpha because my eldest always talks about the fact that he's just missed out 1 year on being Gen Alpha, I believe. So I think, I mean, ultimately, we're not going to do that now, but a lot of this comes down to what's the goal of education, or you could even say what's the goal of public schooling. And then that probably helps clarify this conversation a little bit more. But I really enjoy the fact that we're kind of bouncing around a little bit. I want to pull up something you said around relationships, and it kind of brings up this idea of communication and not being able to talk to each other. To play devil's advocate, there is probably an argument to be had that they do know how to talk to each other. They just know how to do it through a screen. And it could be the fact that obviously we're communicating in two different environments. Now, one of the things that I think is fascinating about that conversation is that it is, I would say it's emerging right now. And you would argue that obviously we should have more wisdom and experience to provide guidance for this new world. And we're probably not doing it because it's moving so quickly because we don't understand it.
Right.
So what it relates to is if you fast forward 20 years, is this going to be the primary means of communication? My gut feeling and hope is it's not. So when you start saying, well, to your point, Cyndi, well, you're going to have to go and know how to sit down and have a difficult conversation with someone, whether it's a case of asking them for $500,000 to fund your project, letting them go because, you've run into kind of fiscal challenges.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a case of letting them know that their behavior was unacceptable, or simply providing them feedback so they can be better people, I think that's going to primarily, I'd like to think, one, it continues to be something that we do as people. We don't kind of like outsource it to
Right.
AI. And B, that it happens in person. When you assume that that's going to continue, then to your point, you need those skills. Whether or not we're collaborating in real time in professional environments, I don't know. But I think that even that scenario, there is a professional reason as to why we need to collaborate and communicate and interact with each other. I certainly would assume that parenting is about human relationships. Romantic relationships is about human relationships. So life will continue to require all of the things that you're seeing as a challenge, a problem. And so I think we as adults need to find a way of stepping in and providing support for that. And I think it should come at the earlier years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult not to get into the electronics piece here, but I think it's just a case of, if we hold back from the electronics a little later, they probably have already developed the skills. If you've already developed the interpersonal relationships, the interactions, being able to deal with arguments and fights, and you're in a situation where then introduce the technology, allow them to go on social media, but they probably now have both sets of skills. What's happening is we're allowing so much of the relationships to develop through these electronic devices at an early age that they're not developing all of the other skills that you're talking about. So now they're suddenly going in and having to develop them into the workforce. And I think that's where we're going wrong in terms of that particular problem. And the question is that something that schools should be in charge of? Because I would argue that probably schools, they are focused on content, and they may not have always seen that as their role, because that's happening while they're bike riding at home or through imaginative play.
Right.
And all of that is going away because of these highly structured extracurricular activities and the technology.
Yeah.
So now what we're going to do, we're going to throw another thing at schools to do. Hey, you must teach children how to look at each other in the eyes when they're talking. And it's like we keep throwing more and more things at schools. And it's like, it's not realistic. There's not that many hours in the day. The schools need support from the community, from the families.
And Matt, I just want to point out, you talked about, like, how do you let someone go? Like, how do you have that communication? But the interesting thing is, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I had to have a difficult conversation with someone and send them an email that was challenging. And I didn't want to come across as snarky or mean. So what did I do? I put it into generative AI, ChatGPT, and I said, can you make this sound kind and make sure is there anything in it that makes it sound negative or mean, or, that might be misinterpreted? And then it rewrote the email. It pointed out some significant areas where I needed to improve it. It gave me some suggestions on how to improve it, and then I conveyed it. But I don't think I could have done it if I didn't have generative AI. So in some ways, it might be able to help us in the future really be able to communicate in more effective ways, at least online.
Yeah, I was going to say, at least online. I would push back and say my fear would be that you don't even ask AI. That AI I need this email to go out. You know my personality. Here's the situation. AI does it for you.
Yep.
I received that email. And I think even to this day, I get an email like that, and I'm going to be like, oh, what? You're AIing me? You're ChatGPTing me? Why don't you pick up the phone and have a conversation with me? I mean, and then, because then now I feel more dismissed. You may have used all of the great, wonderful words, but I actually feel more dismissed. Now, granted, I'm more aware of AI, and I'm a lot more sensitive to AI language at the moment. Mm-hmm. But my gut feeling is 5-6 years when everyone is like, you just AI'd me, or, you just ChatGPT.
But would you even know that? We were just talking about, once it learns your voice and it's becoming more and more sophisticated, will someone even, we can tell now. And I actually got an administrator had emailed me, and I knew it was generated by ChatGPT. And I read it to my family, and they all laughed and said, oh, is it going to give you a recipe for cupcakes as well? And I thought, why are they AIing me? But in the future, that's not going to be the case. It's going to be able to replicate our tone, our voice. So then you won't really know.
But that's why I say, pick up the phone, or like, obviously I'm becoming more traditional, but but you know what? It goes back to my first point though, right? So maybe it's a case of that isn't important in the future. Maybe those interpersonal skills, like let's go extreme. maybe based on what you're saying is 20 years from now, the face-to-face interactions are minimal. And therefore, hey, maybe the young kids should be learning to just communicate online. And everything you said, the concerns you just expressed, it's like, dare I say, and I'm an advocate for handwriting, though I wasn't, I am, and now maybe it's a case of the whole conversation about handwriting, and more recently, people complaining that people don't know typing skills because they're all on the listen, do they need it, right? But that would be a heartbreaking future for me, Yeah, that might be time for me to go and find somewhere where there's no electronics. It could just be my age.
I think we're sounding very old here, because I will tell you, it cracked me up when you just said, maybe we just need to pick up the phone, because I will literally say to my kids, why don't you just, we're at the mall, why don't you just call your friend to find out where they are? Nope, I'm not doing it. I will not use the phone. They will not use the phone.
Oh, my eldest, he doesn't know how to use it. We call him. He doesn't know how to use it. We're trying to get him to teach him that you're meant to put it up to his lips.
I love the fact, if you're just listening, Matt just put up his pinky and his thumb like he's like, that's the phone now. That's not what a phone looks like. The phone looks like this, Matt.
Yeah. But no, they don't. They don't know how to communicate. But
it could come back. I mean, who knows, right? But I think it's really interesting having this conversation. It's almost the beginning of June of 2025 to see where we're going to be at in a couple of years. If we still have the podcast, we can revisit this episode.
Before we go, though, what I would say is what's interesting is that one of the things you're making me think about as I reflect on the year, and I think about my practice, and we had this with John Guerra this year. We were speaking about the role of the teacher is more about being the mentor. And in fact, the film last week, my colleague, John Murphy, also was talking about this, right? What's the future role of the teacher? Because it's not just AI, even before AI, the idea of accessing content through the teacher, right? It feels a little like there's a lot more effective ways to access content. And so I think the teacher is providing that mentorship, that real world life experience. But the word real world now looks, in my mind, very different.
Yeah.
Real world is everything we just spoke about.
Yeah.
From the field trips to being able to look and interact with people, to have hard conversations, being able to interact with objects and talk about your feelings and what you think and feel, and shifting perspectives, being able to, we're getting into AI literacy, but being able to recognize maybe when it's appropriate to engage in an electronics form of communication versus when it's more appropriate to do something in person. I think that's something that's going to be particularly applicable. And I think all of that comes down to facilitating real world experiences in our classroom and us as teachers modeling that behavior and being able to kind of provide that mentorship and guidance as our children and students learn to interact and navigate this new world with AI. I think that's going to become more and more important, and it's something that I've recognized was one of the main focuses of my teaching this semester. Less content and more about real world stuff.
Yes. So Matt, we are out of time. I mean, we've been recording for 35 minutes and we tried to do it under 30. So let's continue this conversation on our LinkedIn group, which is the Fueling Creativity and Education podcast group. And let's talk with the members of this group about what they think are the skills for high schoolers. What are the skills and abilities we want our high schoolers to walk away with? How do we need to make some switches? So if you're listening to this episode, come and join us over on the LinkedIn page at Fueling Creativity and Education podcast. It's been a great year, Matt, and I am looking forward to seeing what's going to happen in season 11. And we've got a great Listen and Learn series, which we'll tell you about. You want to talk about it? Or you want me to talk about it?
Well, it was your brilliant idea. I think you should be talking about it.
So this summer, we're going to have a Listen and Learn series where we bring in some current books around creativity and education, and we ask the authors to share some tidbits about the book so it can give you some ideas for what you might want to read while you're at the beach this summer.
And not listening to our podcast, possibly. Possibly.
All right. Well, Matt, it's been a great season. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, wishing everyone a really happy summer. I hope you get to disconnect from electronics and get to be human with the people that you care deeply about. My name's Dr. Matthew Worwood.
And my name is Dr. Cyndi Burnett. You've been listening to the Fueling Creativity and Education podcast, hosted by Matthew Worwood and Cyndi Burnett. Our creative producer is Catherine Fu,
Our editor is Sam Atkins, and this episode was made possible thanks to our sponsor, Curiosity to Create.